I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a global podcast where we do a deep dive interview each week with national and international experts, authors, journalists, artists, entertainers, and opinion shapers, and we include your questions and comments. We also invite those of you who have not yet joined our podcast to become members. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging, stimulating, and timely topics and issues, distinguished by consistently high-level content and technical excellence. And to become a member of this podcast, simply go to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we talk to scholar, author, diplomat, and Middle East negotiator, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who served in the Carter and Reagan administrations, as well as having been director of policy planning under President George H.W. Bush and special Middle East coordinator and envoy under President Bill Clinton and advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and President Barack Obama. Author of a couple of books, The Missing Piece and Statecraft, he is published in the Washington Post, New York Times, New Republic, Wall Street Journal, and has taught at Marquette, Harvard, Brandeis, and Georgetown. Co-founder of United Against Iran, he presently serves as counselor and William Davidson Fellow at the Washington Institute. And I remind you, we invite and welcome your questions and comments, and I welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who are joining us for this live broadcast. I should say that Ambassador Ross has served as an architect at the Oslo Accords, but served over 50 years working toward peace between Arabs and Israelis under 5 presidents, as I just pretty much outlined. And has it ever been this bad? Have we ever been at such loggerheads as we are now, with a historical note?
No. It seems remarkable to say it is the worst it's been since I began working on this. And I would even say that the mutual trauma suffered by Israelis because of October 7th and its aftermath, and Palestinians because of the war in Gaza and the suffering imposed on them, has created a kind of reversion to what I would say an existential struggle again. One of the things that marked Oslo is that Oslo represented mutual recognition after mutual denial and mutual rejection. Understand we have 2 national identities and 2 national movements competing for the same space. And before Oslo, the mutual rejection meant this was an existential conflict. Oslo turned it into a political conflict. Now, in the end, we weren't able to resolve, obviously, this conflict, but at least it was really about how you come up with resolving the borders, security, Jerusalem, and refugees. But these were issues designed to be discussed, negotiated, and ultimately resolved in the spirit of this being a conflict that could be resolved. It was not a conflict about mutual rejection. Right now, if you look at Israelis and Palestinians, that mutual sense of trauma makes them incapable of in any way identifying with the other's pain, and in a lot of ways takes us back to 1948 and the existence of the struggle and the competition over the land that they both claim and have strong historical claims to. That's what makes it, I think, so different now, and because there's just a complete loss of belief on each side.
The other thing striking me about what makes it different is the fact that Hamas plays a preeminent role now, and also in the past, Israel was not, it's always been politically divided, but not like it is now, not with this conservative coalition, which is very different than anything you had negotiated with.
For sure. Look, I negotiated with Bibi Netanyahu the first time he was prime minister from 1997 until 1999. 1996 to 1999, and I certainly negotiated when he became prime minister again, but he was always someone who had room for maneuver. He is a master maneuverer, and he had governments where there were people to his left and to his right. In this government, he is to the left of the rest of his own government. This is not the same Likud party that it was then, certainly not the Likud party of Menachem Begin. And now you have not only the ultra-religious in, which is not new, but you have messianic nationalists in, like Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. He has lost his maneuvering room, and the net effect of that is that we're seeing a government that seems to operate on the basis of sort of careening from problem to problem.
We also have a humanitarian crisis that's unprecedented, and it's almost more like Yemen or Sudan in some ways.
It really is. I mean, Gaza was always impoverished. That's not new. But, and even there were 4 previous conflicts from 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, all basically provoked by Hamas. And Hamas, after 2014, when you had a conflict that went on for 51 days, there was a real need for reconstruction, and there were efforts to produce it, but Hamas was in control, and no one was prepared to invest in rebuilding Gaza when they knew that Hamas remained committed to rebuilding its military capability, but not rebuilding Gaza.
You mentioned 2014. It brings to mind some speculating that this has been planned, that is, October 7th has been planned since 2014, and there's evidence of that Sinwar particularly had a kind of map that he was looking at that would force, well, no kind of rapprochement between Israel and the Saudis, and also ensure that there would be ongoing conflict that would raise the interest throughout the world against, well, not only interest, but there would be total disapproval of Israel, almost as if there was kind of a conspiratorial map to this. You put any credence in that?
I put credence in his having planned this for a long time. Look, this is a guy who is absolutely committed to his mission of the destruction of Israel. This defines who he is. This is a guy who the Israelis completely misread. I can tell you, last June when I was in Israel and I met all the senior military and intelligence people, uniformly, they said to me, we understand Sinwar because he has a prisoner's mentality. He served 23 years in Israeli jails, primarily for killing killing Palestinian collaborators, people he considered to be collaborators with Israel. He killed a fair number of them. And the Israelis felt, okay, we understand him. He has a prisoner's mentality. What they meant by that was he will act to raise pressures as a way of getting us to give him certain concessions. So he would do it to get more Palestinians from Gaza worker permits in Israel. He would do it to get the areas for Palestinian fishermen to be extended outward more into the Mediterranean. Everything was geared in their mind to do it to sort of gain some kind of concession or reward. And they even interpreted some of the increases in tension to his effort to get Qatar, who was, basically paying him to preserve calm, getting them to provide more money to him. So that's how they read him. They did not read him. They didn't say he was giving up his ideology, but they said to me uniformly, he has no interest in war with us. We have deterrence and it's working. And they completely misread that.
There's been a lot of misreading by Israel. I mean, what once was considered an extraordinary intelligence network for Israel, failed on October 7th. I mean, recently there was some very precise bombing in Damascus, but the fact of the matter is that there was very terrible imprecision in terms of the world's central kitchen, and they were targeted, and now there has to be a whole examination of what occurred. But this is not the sort of thing that was ever associated with Israeli intelligence and Israeli immaculate sense of conducting itself militarily and in every other way.
Look, I would say that there's always a difference between tactical intelligence and strategic intelligence. Their tactical intelligence remains remarkable. They killed Salah Aruri, who was the number 3 in Hamas, who was in Beirut, in southern Beirut, in the stronghold of Hezbollah. And he was in a building, and when they took him and his 3 assistants out, no Hezbollah, no Lebanese were hurt in the process, meaning they didn't go after him at a time when anybody from Hezbollah might be with him, which meant their real-time intelligence was pretty extraordinary. What they just did in Damascus, the Zahidi, the most important leader of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guard in Lebanon, in Syria, even in Iraq. Not like Soleimani, who lived in a very high public profile. This is a guy who basically lived with a very low public profile, didn't expose himself, assumed that he was a target for the Israelis, and yet they knew exactly where he was and they got him. So in terms of some of their tactical intelligence and their ability to fuse their tactical intelligence with the ability to act on it militarily, they're still pretty extraordinary. When it comes to the strategic intelligence, that's different. They made assumptions about Hamas that were completely wrong. They focused their forces both in the north and in the West Bank. They left the south largely denuded. They weren't prepared at all. It's not just that they were surprised, it's that the military had no plans for anything like this. And this was a classic example that the strategic surprise, which is always a function of assumptions that are fundamentally flawed, and yet those assumptions provide a prism through which you see the world and interpret information. That's what led to the strategic surprise of October 7th. And I would say that what happened with the World Central Kitchen, this was more their military because it was a drone unit that was watching these three trucks, and they saw someone they saw as a Hamas operative in one of the trucks before it went into a warehouse. They apparently tried to reach the trucks by phone with no luck. They talked to the Central World Central Kitchen, who tried to reach the people by phone and couldn't. They didn't afterwards see the Hamas guys, and the reason they have removed a colonel and a major is that they violated the rules of engagement, that there wasn't enough clarity to be sure who these trucks were before they went ahead and they destroyed them. So this was based on the military guys looking at what the images were from the drones and then making a set of judgments without necessarily moving it up the chain and requiring approval from anybody else. And with just truly terrible consequences, because something like this happens. It's not that you don't have accidents in war, but the timing of some of these can create tipping points. I'll give you two examples related to Lebanon. In 1996, the Israelis were fighting Hezbollah. It was mostly air, not on the ground, but they hit Qana, which was a UN facility in southern Lebanon where a number of Lebanese were sheltering. And it changed. I was there then. It changed what we were prepared to do then. We insisted on a number of steps they would take after that. The same thing repeated itself in 2006 with Condi Rice, who, when the Israelis hit Qana again, when there were 100 people sheltering there, she said, "That's it. This is over." And she said, "This is over in 48 hours. That's it." Left no room for any discussion. And now you have the World Central Kitchen, and you also see that President Biden adopted a position very different than what he was adopting before, basically telling Bibi Netanyahu, if you don't dramatically increase in a way we can see in the very short term, meaning within the next day, how you're going to ensure that there's humanitarian assistance going into Gaza, we will reassess our policy towards you on Gaza. And Bibi took that very seriously. So just like with the two Qanas, there was an event that changed the context. And this has the same kind of feeling to it.
World Central Kitchen, I think, has shifted, especially where the American administration presently is, and they also have to play to their, shall we say, left flank, which has been very critical of Israel, to put it mildly. I'm just wondering, though, what your thoughts are in terms of the sense one has that there's maybe much less discretion or something about who's being shot at. I mean, you think about those three hostages who were Israelis who were holding up a white flag, and they were shot down too. Some of this has gone on, through many, many wars, the hell of many wars, but it seems like the Israelis are not quite as, frankly, well equipped as they used to be to ensure safety and ensure that the people who are collateral damage are not being damaged. I mean, I can remember, for example, in the Afghanistan involvement for the United States, this would happen all the time. You'd have a wedding party and they'd get hit, and all these sad, catastrophic, tragic stories.
Right.
But Israel had a much cleaner reputation with these kinds of things.
I think part of it has to do with the nature of the conflict. And by that I mean, and this was absolutely the case in terms of the 3 hostages who were killed by the Israelis after they freed themselves. Actually, their holders ran off. And in that case, you had Israeli soldiers on the ground who were constantly being subjected to ambushes on the one hand, and they'd had previous experience where people waved white flags and then opened fire on them. So you create a context where you have a hair trigger because you're convinced there's a trap here, and that's what produced that case. Although there again, they violated the rules of engagement. That if someone's waving a white flag, you don't shoot at them. And that was expressly what the position was. So it also suggests that there was some breakdown in discipline, both in that case and I would say in this one as well, where there are an explicit set of rules of engagement and they were violated, which is why you've had, to have a colonel and a major removed from their positions is not a small thing, and is designed to send a message to others.
What about Jose Andres, who is the head of World Central Kitchen, saying they were targeted? It was not a mistake, and they wanted to kill those humanitarian workers.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I do think what's true is that it gets to the heart of something you were saying before. They do seem to be operating on a more of a hair trigger than they have in other circumstances. And part of that is the nature of what they're facing there. And I think part of that is also a sense that Hamas takes advantage of the humanitarian assistance, diverts the humanitarian assistance, diverts it for its own purposes, and it's produced, I think, that kind of again, more of a hair trigger as a result. And I'd say maybe one other thing. October 7th and the image of October 7th, the reality of October 7th, the fact that there are still hostages, the fact that the hostages, that not only were people brutalized on October 7th, meaning you had kids killed in front of their parents, parents in front of their kids, you had mutilations, you had dismemberment, you had rapes, that carries part of I think that's part of the legacy of October 7th in the minds of Israeli soldiers as well. And even if they're not doing those things, they operate on much less of a hair trigger than might have been the case before.
Could there be, in your judgment, maybe a breakup of the present coalition that has Bibi Netanyahu in power because of the Haredi being conscripted? This seems to be a kind of wild card in all this. That is the ultra-Orthodox who have been free of the draft, for those of you who don't follow this.
Yeah. It is, I think, if the coalition were to fall, I do believe we will see elections within a year. I can't tell you if they're going to be 3 months or 10 months, but I think this will be administration, this government will be a very difficult government to maintain.
Well, October 7th happened on their watch. I mean, that's the biggest
factor.
It did, yeah.
And it's why I say it's difficult to maintain, partly because there's going to come a point when this gets back to what you just said. There's going to come a point, and my guess is before the end of this year, where all the senior military and all the senior intelligence people are going to resign and assume responsibility for what happened on October 7th. But when they do it, they're very likely to say, but we are carrying out the policy of this government and this prime minister. So while we will assume our responsibility and we will resign, we think he should as well. And he won't. And I think when that happens, you're going to have probably 1 million people in the street, probably the Histadrut, which is the labor federation, its leadership will probably call a general strike. And out of that kind of convulsion, you will probably see a new date for an election picked. I don't know when that will happen. It'll happen before the end of the year. That's one scenario. The other scenario is what you were raising. Last June 30th, the law that provided for the draft and which permitted exemptions of the Haredi students, that law lapsed. And the Supreme Court in Israel mandated that by March 31st of 2024, so it's not like they were not giving them some time, there had to be new legislation to address the issue of the lack of equity in terms of those who are subject to the draft. Bibi could not come to an understanding on that before March 31, so the court mandated that there was no longer a legal basis on which to provide state subsidies to those students studying Torah in yeshiva who were eligible for the draft age-wise and had not registered for it. So the subsidies to them stopped. Now that creates a pressure on the religious parties. They can fill in for a short period of time. Right now, you have the Passover recess for the for the Knesset, and it's out until May 19th. So there's basically a respite until May 19th before something has to happen, meaning that the religious parties might come back and say, that's it, you didn't address our needs, so we're leaving. Bibi, I think, will do whatever it takes to try to prevent that. The problem for him is, to satisfy them, he will alienate the vast majority of Israelis who right now are suffering through a much bigger burden on them when it comes to being in the reserves, having the reserve service extended, having to have it repeated over and over again, and given personnel shortages, extending what will be the active duty time for people when they go in. They will increase up to from 32 months to 36 months for the men. The women are still 2 years. But their reserve service, which is now a couple weeks a year until they're in their early 30s, that'll go until late 40s, and it'll probably be 40 days a year. So the idea that you bear the entire burden and you're, one of the proposals that was made was to keep these exemptions until the age 35, which on its face will drive everybody in Israel who's not exempted crazy. And that, if that isn't sorted out, if Bibi is able to get his current government to address that in a way that satisfies the religious, it will further alienate the public in a way that makes any election almost a certainty to ensure that this government will not be in power again. And it puts, I think, his possibility of remaining prime minister, if there is another election, at a very low probability.
We're talking with Ambassador Dennis Ross, and I want to go to some of your questions. A lot of questions coming in. We'll go to as many as we can. I just need to ask, though, Ambassador, what your thoughts are in terms of Bibi Netanyahu trying to essentially keep things going so he can stay out of prison, because that may be in the works for him.
I don't, look, this is a case that's been going on for 4 years, doesn't show much sign of being on any kind of accelerated timetable. So I don't know how much the case is what drives him. I mean, there are plenty of people who believe that's the case. I suspect people who've been in power for a very long time have a very hard time giving it up. This is Israel's longest serving prime minister. He was out of power for 1 year, and he came back. And I just think he has a self-image that what's good for him is good for the country. He's convinced himself that nobody else can really run the country. And he's at a point where 70% of the Israeli public doesn't trust him and doesn't trust his government. So if you think you have to be the one in power and 70% of the country doesn't trust you right now, that probably gives you a pretty strong incentive to try to stay in power and avoid an election.
And some questions, as I said, coming in. Let me thank those of you who are putting questions for Ambassador Ross here. We'll start with Braden in Chicago. who says casualty numbers are essentially supplied by Hamas. How do we know what the true numbers are? I guess we don't, do we, really?
We don't know what the true numbers are. And Hamas has no incentive to give lower estimates of the numbers. So, I think that's both true, but I also find that when some people raise this issue, it's as if to say, well, there aren't so many people who've been killed. And I think the unfortunate, sad, tragic truth is that even if the numbers aren't 32 or 33,000, and let's say the Israelis, the IDF thinks that they have killed 13,000 Hamas, they probably have 1,500 Hamas prisoners now. But that number is growing, especially after the Shifa hospital. Why is that significant? And I'll come back to the numbers in a second. It's significant because when they went to Shifa hospital, aside from the fact that Hamas had gone back and was using the hospital all over again, just as the Israelis had claimed, as a fundamental command center, the Israelis basically were able to arrest 500 Hamas operatives and killed 200. 200 resisted them and 500 surrendered. Now, Hamas is made up of those who usually prize martyrdom as part of their ideology. This suggests that there's quite a few Hamas that are not rushing to become martyrs, and they were quicker to surrender than they were to resist. So that also says something about what's happening to Hamas, and I think it gives, it creates an understanding that the nature of this conflict right now is changing. Look, Israel has succeeded in dismantling probably 20 of the 24 battalions that Hamas had. The last 4 are in Rafah. Hamas had become a military with a very big military industrial base. I was on one of the bases where the Israelis had brought captured equipment. It was unbelievable what they were producing. They were producing their own drones. They were producing their own mortars. They were producing their own rockets. They were producing their own ammunition. This was a very big industrial base, all underground. Israel has dismantled the military. It's dismantling its military infrastructure. I would like to see the Israelis say the definition of success is demilitarization of Gaza, because Israel is not that far from achieving that. And I would like the administration to basically say, let's sit down and let's talk about how much is enough. Because the Israelis need to define an objective in which they can succeed. When the Prime Minister Netanyahu says total victory, I have no clue as to what that means.
It's almost nonsense in a way. I mean, the idea of destroying Hamas, which is also part of his rhetoric, maybe beyond our conception or beyond their conception. It's like saying we've destroyed ISIS, which you hear from various American officials. We saw how much ISIS-K was destroyed, for example, with what happened in Moscow, or what happened, in targets against Iranian officials by ISIS. I mean, it's not something that you're going to destroy, particularly when you think about all those tunnels and what they built. They built an infrastructure. It's unbelievable. And
it is unbelievable.
The mind reels when one just tries to conceive of all that they have.
I mean, 2 points I would make. You're absolutely right to touch on ISIS. We have 3,000 forces in Iraq and 900 in Syria and a couple hundred in Jordan for one purpose only, to prevent ISIS from reemerging. It means you can't eliminate an idea, and this is an extremist Islamist idea, we didn't. We defeated them as a military. Israel has already defeated Hamas as a military. One thing I want to note about, we were talking about this huge industrial base that they created. They created 400 miles of tunnels, 30,000 tons of cement, probably 10,000 tons of metal. I was in one of the tunnels just below Erez. There's a hole along the ceiling. It's all piping. You could drive a car in this tunnel. They built an underground city while they continued to ensure that the people who lived on the surface were completely impoverished. Hamas may have turned Gaza into an open-air prison for the people who live there, but not for themselves. They got whatever they needed.
And they could have, certainly. I mean, they could have built, you got people like Jared Kushner talking about good resort possibilities, and Gaza and all that sort of thing. They could have certainly done a great deal for those people in education and so many ways that they just pretty much decided to not pay attention to because they were too busy building the tunnels.
Correct.
Let me go to another question here. This is Graham in Austin, Texas, who says, how has the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan affected the broader Middle East region, particularly in terms of security and power vacuums?
I don't think it affected the power vacuums because we still had 40,000 forces that we kept in the Middle East. So we didn't withdraw from the Middle East. We did withdraw from Afghanistan. I think it's fair to say the way we withdrew from Afghanistan, you could debate whether it made sense to withdraw from Afghanistan or not. The way we withdrew from Afghanistan affected the perception of us. It certainly affected the perception of what the America was prepared to do in the region. It raised questions and doubts about us. Probably the Chinese and the Russians saw this as something that they could take advantage of, by the way, not by rushing into Afghanistan, because, by the way, they have not. Even though at one point the Chinese thought that they would be able to exploit all the mineral wealth in Afghanistan, which is quite real, and they found they couldn't because it's basically, it's with the Taliban in control, you can't count on anything. And so neither one of them have been able to exploit that. But the fact is, this was not a testament in the eyes of many to a range of Americans' commitment to staying in the region, and even there was a question that emerged about American competence. Why would you withdraw your forces before you withdrew all the civilians who you needed to withdraw? So there were basic questions about both the logic and the competence and what it said about America's commitment to being in the broader Middle East. But I don't think it fundamentally changed the reality, because we didn't withdraw our military presence in the region, which is still quite formidable.
Here's Susan from Washington, D.C. Thank you for the question, Susan. Wants to know, what role do you see for Turkey in the evolving Middle East political landscape, considering its recent more active foreign policy?
Interesting question, because they're one of the supporters of Hamas.
Erdogan has been moving more to the right all along here, hasn't he?
He's always identified, his party, the AKP, is an Islamist party.
Yeah.
He was, why he emerged and was successful as a politician was because he was very pragmatic, was guided less by that ideology and much more. He was initially the mayor of Istanbul. He did a lot to improve dramatically the economy in Turkey, and that's what built his authority and his credibility and ultimately his successful political career. Once he became president, then he began to not only move to the right, he began to erode some of the democratic checks and balances within Turkey. Though he tends to be fair to him, he continued to respect the election process, even if he helped to color how the media would cover it. But we just saw his candidate in Istanbul lost. And the winner of that is probably going to be someone who will challenge him in the next presidential election. He has ambitions for the Middle East, for sure. He still will make adjustments to reality and pragmatism when it comes to the economy. He did some things with the economy that made no sense, meaning he lowered interest rates when they already had huge deficits. He triggered very high inflation as a result. They're still suffering from high inflation, which I think helps to account for what happened in this election. He's adopted a very, I would say, extreme language towards Israel. No extreme language, by the way, towards Hamas. He continues to defend Hamas. There's no, you can be, and people ask me, do I want to see an end to occupation, Israeli occupation? You bet, I want to see an end to Israeli occupation. Do I want to see lawless extremist Israeli settlers get punished and put in prison? You bet I want to see that. But if you are going to go and justify what Hamas did, you lose your moral authority to talk about this issue. This is Hamas. To put in perspective, Hamas, and you touched on this, Michael. Why did they choose the timing they did? Because they saw normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they were acting to prevent that. And this is totally in keeping with what their behavior was in the past. You know, I want to give you one example of just how profound and how pernicious their behavior was. After Rabin was assassinated, the right in Israel was discredited by the assassination. More than that, the Israeli public saw that the Palestinian public was mourning the death of Rabin, the assassination of Rabin. It created a very different perspective on the Palestinians as a result. I had, at the time, I was our negotiator, and I had dinner with a number of Likudniks one night, not about a month after the assassination, and they said to me, Paris will be able to achieve with the assassination what Rabin never could have achieved in life, because the Israeli public is prepared. They see the Palestinians differently, and they will go along with the concessions he wants to make. Now, they weren't saying this happily because they didn't believe in those kinds of concessions, but this is what they were saying. And what did Hamas do? 4 bombs in 9 days that shook the faith of Israelis. Suddenly the question became, this is the peace that Paris is going to produce? We can't get on a bus. The same bus route, bus 18 in Jerusalem, was bombed, suicide bombers on successive Sundays. The next day after that, kids in their Purim costumes were victims of bombs, of a suicide bomber in Tel Aviv. They didn't do this because they wanted peace. They didn't do this because they wanted advance. They did it to prevent it. 6 months before the assassination, I used to meet with Rabin Saturday afternoons at his apartment, not to go over the negotiations and the details and possible trade-offs and so forth, but to have broader strategic discussions on where things were going in the region. And 6 months before, this Saturday afternoon, he started with something else. He just sits back and he says to me, who do you think is going to determine the next election in Israel? So I tried to show him how smart I was about Israeli politics, and I said, Ari Deri of Shas, a Sephardic religious party, very conservative, and by the way, he's still there. And Rabin goes, no, guess again. And I said, no, you tell me. And he said, Hamas, 2 Hamas bombs, and Bibi Netanyahu was prime minister, not me, 6 months before the assassination. This is Hamas. This is what their aim is. So you have criticisms of the Israelis in terms of their approach to Palestinians. That's fair. But anyone who would defend Hamas and what they've done, aside from keeping Gaza completely impoverished, aside from not allowing any Palestinians other than Hamas to be in the tunnels, which could have protected Palestinians, there is no way to justify or rationalize their behavior. None.
What kind of boggles my mind, though, is the indictment of Israel as being genocidal. I mean, I could understand the anger and the outrage and the frustration of thousands of innocent Palestinians dying, but genocidal for people who came out of the Holocaust, first of all, but also, I mean, that charge and what genocide even means. But Hamas is certainly, by many of those who are critical of Israel, sort of exempted from that. And they're also exempted from what they want to do to LGBTQ people and so forth. They have support from those ranks when the reality is, they are very genocidal in what they'd like to do to those people, or for that matter, to the Jewish people. That's just one of the strangest ironies that is difficult to grasp.
What bothers me about that, aside from the fact that it ignores the legal definition of genocide, which is the intent to eradicate a people. You can bemoan how many Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, but there's no effort to eradicate the Palestinian people. Why would Israel drop, hundreds of thousands of leaflets to get people to evacuate areas?
Or why would they have Palestinians in the Knesset and Palestinians living in the midst in a very sizable way in their own nation?
Look, it's not when you use the term, this is a term that should be reserved for what it is and when it's applied in Rwanda, with the Khmer Rouge, the Shoah, the Holocaust. That was genocide. You apply it here where it's not, doesn't even fit the legal definition, you cheapen the term. Why would you want to cheapen the term other than the fact that you want to use it as a way to indict Israel and try to delegitimize Israel? It is a deliberate political, it reflects a deliberate political agenda. It doesn't reflect what is an honest understanding, even a technical understanding of what the term means. And as I said, why you would want to cheapen the term is beyond me.
The question from Harris in Miami, Florida, he says, how do demographic changes, such as youth unemployment and urbanization, affect the political and social landscape of the Middle East?
It's an interesting question because you see a number of states, especially the Gulf states, creating policies designed to deal with what they see are those kinds of dislocations. They understand the potential volatility of youth unemployment. These are people for whom demagogic appeals, especially if they're unemployed, can be quite compelling. They are trying to create decent governance, effective economies. You see this with the Emirates. You see it with the Saudis. They're both oil-rich states, obviously, but they're trying to build economies that are based not on oil, and they're producing, as I said, decent governance. Bahrain, which is not oil-rich, is adjusting as well. So these factors are, by the way, they have contributed to the Abraham Accords. By the way, none of those countries that have them have walked away from them. They're going more slowly in terms of what they're doing with Israel, but they're not walking away from it. They were attracted to this because they understood that if they're going to have decent governance and they're going to have effective economies and they're going to deal with climate change, which is producing genuine water security issues, food security issues, the pandemic demonstrated the health security issues, cyber attacks demonstrate cybersecurity issues, and who's cutting edge in all those areas? Israel. Israel solved its own water problem. Israel creates drought-resistant crops. Israel leads the world in drip irrigation technology and underground irrigation technology, which is critical in the Middle East because of evaporation. In Iran, as an example, 70 to 80% of their water is lost through evaporation. So not that Iran is going to do anything with Israel other than, as the Supreme Leader says, Israel is a cancer in the area and it won't exist in 25 years and shouldn't exist. One member state calling for the eradication of another member state. You could say that's genocidal, but apparently that doesn't rise to that definition for some. In any way, in answer to your question, the reality is there is an understanding that Israel is a natural partner in terms of dealing with what many of these countries need. Now, what's happened in Gaza raises the cost to them of doing things with Israel, certainly in public. And almost all Arab regimes, anyone who has, a relationship with the Israelis is put on the defensive because of it, because the images are shown nonstop on the Arab satellite TVs. And it's understandable. If you see, is this what you're seeing all the time? You see death and destruction, women and children, it's going to affect you, and it has. But the facts, the reality that created the Abraham Accords in the first place, they haven't disappeared.
I think you've pointed out in some of your writing the necessity for Egypt to play not only a greater role, but also not be such a sieve for the kinds of things that go into Hamas's hands.
Absolutely. No, look, you hear the Israelis are talking about moving against Rafah and the 4 remaining battalions. Even if you move against 4 remaining battalions, if there is not a mechanism that is worked out in full coordination and agreement with the Egyptians, this is a border that has been a sieve. I said earlier, Hamas got whatever it wanted. The public may not have, but Hamas got whatever materials it wanted. And that was coming underground up to Rafah and probably on the surface to Rafah as well. Egypt, in the end, has no incentive for Hamas to still be in power when this is over, have no incentive to allow the remilitarization of Gaza, because ultimately it is a threat to Egypt as well. So I want the administration to broker an understanding on this, and you have to have that understanding whether you've dealt with the 4 battalions or not.
Forgive me, Egypt has certainly a strong interest in keeping Palestinians out of Egypt. I mean, we've seen that characteristically.
100%. Absolutely 100%.
I was also going to ask you, where's Hezbollah in all this? I mean, initially they were talking about, a front for Lebanon and striking back at the Israelis. You certainly seen the Houthis trying to strike at the Israelis, all these Iranian proxies. But where particularly is Hezbollah in this? Because clearly they would like to hit the Israelis.
Well, they have been hitting the Israelis, but in a highly geographically narrow way.
I mean, with greater ferocity or greater intensity.
Yeah, Hezbollah is motivated by the survival of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has turned Lebanon into a failed state. You have 40% of all the doctors and nurses in Lebanon have left. It has a failed economy, and Hezbollah is the reason for that. So Christians, Druze, and Sunnis not only have no love lost for Hezbollah, if Israel were to come in and dramatically weaken militarily Hezbollah would become quite vulnerable to all of its enemies within Lebanon, number one. So that gives a reason not to get into an all-out war. The second reason is that the Shia base of Hezbollah, primarily southern Beirut and southern Lebanon, they don't want it. They don't want a war because they know they're going to pay the price for it. So that's a second factor. A third factor is that Iran doesn't want an all-out war because Hezbollah is their most important proxy by far. It trains all the other proxies. It has acted in Syria. It acted like Iran's foreign legion. It provided the shock troops for the war in Syria. And with 150,000 rockets, it's the ultimate deterrent for Israel striking Iran's nuclear infrastructure, which they want to protect at all costs. So there is not an incentive for Iran or Hezbollah to get into an all-out war with Israel. If that was the case, you would have seen it already. Now, having said everything I just said, they are firing across the border on a daily basis. Israel has evacuated 80,000 people from the north. They can't live in their homes. Kiryat Shmona, as an example. Metula and Kiryat Shmona, many of their buildings have been destroyed. There's nobody there, but Hezbollah has done it. In the meantime, Israel has basically cleaned out the entire Hezbollah infrastructure from the border to the Litani River. Hezbollah has lost a lot of its most senior commanders, so they've paid a price, but they've also tied the Israelis down, and they've prevented the northern part of Israel from being repopulated, which is not something that Israel will tolerate forever. So there is a risk of escalation, in part because each side, as they're hitting, are slowly ratcheting up the kind of targets that they're hitting. And when you use force to signal, you can hit the wrong target. And even if you don't intend an escalation, you could end up with one. I don't believe the Iranian response to the killing of General Zaidi, he went by a different name, of Mahmoud Ahmadavi. He was the most important Revolutionary Guard operative since Soleimani. And the Israelis, as I said earlier, they took him out. And they took him out along with all of his senior deputies. Iran has said it's going to retaliate. I believe they will, but I also believe they will do it in a way that is not designed to trigger an all-out war. Iran, I'm very close to finishing a new book, and one of the chapters is on Iran, and I go through and I show the consistent pattern of the Iranians always drawing back whenever they might be involved in a direct military conflict. They're very good at having other people die, and they're quite willing to fight to the last of their proxies other than Hezbollah. They're not at all keen to have their own people die.
Big question comes to us from Jerry in Colorado. He wants to know, is the two-state solution finally a dead issue? You certainly wouldn't think so if you were hearing from President Biden or Tom Friedman or a whole list of people who come to my mind.
Well, you can't produce it anytime soon because there's complete disbelief on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. But it has to still be out there for a simple reason. The alternative is one state. In one state, I said this earlier, you have two national identities. Neither one is going to subordinate itself to the other. You have two national identities, two national movements. They will not be satisfied without a state of their own. Israel has demonstrated they're not going anyplace. And they're not going to end who they are. Palestinians are also not going anyplace, although both sides need a lot of soul searching. Israel has a kind of democratic institutional structure for that. The Palestinians don't have that, and they need it. But the fact is, one state guarantees these two national identities will be in conflict. And I want to reinforce the point. In the Middle East, there's no such thing as a post-nationalism age. And if you want the Israelis and Palestinians to look like Lebanon, Syria, Libya, Yemen, or even Iraq, where you have more than one identity, and those states are either at war with themselves, failing or completely paralyzed, then that's what you'd wish. This is not a place where conflicting, competitive identities coexist in one state.
So let's look at aftermath, because it's come up over and over again. Hope this war ends, and when it does end, it may drag on, who knows. But afterward, the best thing that you've suggested is demilitarizing in Gaza and being certain that there's demilitarization?
Yep. And you have to reform the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which has terrible governance now, highly corrupt, inefficient, lacks decent governance. You have to reform them, and it's possible because it was done from 2007 to 2012 when all the donors, led actually by the Bush administration, insisted that Mahmoud Abbas appoint an empowered prime minister, Salam Fayyad, who came in and completely cleaned the place up for 5 years, generated a lot of jealousy as a result, and was removed by Abu Mazen after 5 years. We should have played more of a role in preventing that, and we didn't. But the fact is it's been done before, and it needs to be done again. And the reason I say it needs to be done again is not just for the benefit of the West Bank. If you're going to have an alternative to Hamas, you have to have a Palestinian alternative. The only realistic alternative will be a reformed Palestinian Authority that resumes governance in the West Bank, in Gaza, and it's going to take maybe 12 to 18 months to produce that. There are Arab states that are prepared to do what they've never done before, which is to play a bridging role, to be the bridge between the time when this war ends and the Israelis withdraw their forces and the time you can bring back a reformed Palestinian Authority into Gaza. You also need that reformed Palestinian Authority that is governing both the West Bank and Gaza. How do you talk about two states if you continue to have a fundamental division between who's running Gaza, who's running the West Bank? It was precisely that division that Prime Minister Netanyahu had no interest in ending. It was precisely that division which he knew meant who could talk about negotiating two states when you seemingly had two different Palestinian entities, and they couldn't agree among themselves. So, one lesson that has to be learned from this is, you can't have a one-state outcome because that means perpetual conflict. You can't get to a two-state outcome unless you remake the Palestinian Authority and it resumes authority in Gaza. And this will take time. Getting all these pieces aligned is a little bit like putting together a Rubik's Cube.
Well, Abu Mazen has always been more, at least, open to some kind of resolution or at least talking about peace than we certainly identify with Hamas. But at the same time, the West Bank polls show that there's real strong support for Hamas in the West Bank.
There is. Actually, ironically, there's stronger support for Hamas in the West Bank than there is in Gaza.
Exactly my point, yeah.
Yeah. Of course, people in Gaza have experience with Hamas in a way that those in the West Bank do not. Part of this is a little bit of a misnomer simply because in the midst of the war, anger is what's being reflected in the polling. When you get beyond the war, I expect that there'll be some adjustment. But, one of the reasons that there's support for Hamas is because there's such anger at Israel that they say, look, at least Hamas hurt the Israelis. You've heard the old adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is not that adage. This is the adage of who on our side has been able to inflict pain on the Israelis because they inflict pain on us. This is not a productive instinct, but it's an emotional one. And those who think you can get to two states anytime soon are living in illusion. You cannot get to two states anytime soon, but that also means you have to ensure that there aren't steps being taken that make it impossible to get to two states ever. And some of what we do with the Israelis has to be geared towards that. Clearly, some of what we do with the Palestinians has to be geared towards that. You are not going to convince Israelis who today believe that if there were a Palestinian state, it would be run by Hamas. This is 80% of Israelis believe that. And there's no way you're going to move them until they see some behaviors that demonstrate that's not the case, until they see a separation from Hamas, condemnation of Hamas. And you're not going to see that in the midst of this war. So that takes time. And on the Israeli side, they are going to have to prove to Palestinians that they're not going to act in a way that makes a Palestinian state impossible. It means you can't keep building settlements in areas that would be part of a Palestinian state. I came up with a concept back in the year 2000, settlement blocks and swaps. This meant they were settlement blocks you would absorb into Israel, about 5% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line. These were people who moved into the West Bank for economic reasons, not ideological reasons, quality of life reasons, not ideological reasons. If you absorbed all of those who lived in that 5%, now it's about 8%, you could then have a Palestinian state in the rest of it. And the idea of swaps is that you would take territory. If Israel's absorbing territory from the West Bank, it would then swap territory to compensate for what it was taking. This was a concept we developed before we went to Camp David. And it still is a concept that can work now. One mistake that has been made on our side is not to draw a differentiation between building in those areas that are consistent with two states versus building in those areas that are not. We should be very tough on stopping the building in the areas that are inconsistent with two states. We should be open to the building in the areas that would be consistent with two states.
This a lot depends on who's going to be politically in power, who the successors are going to be. Benny Gantz, I guess, is the most likely one, right? Isn't it?
Yeah. In the near term, I think if you take a look at the polling, and you don't know, I suspect we're going to see other people come in. If Naftali Bennett decides to run in his own party again, Yossi Cohen, who was the head of Mossad for a long time, apparently is talking about running. Likud in the next election will be dramatically reduced in size. If the current lineup, the National Unity Party, which is Gantz's, there's a lot of people who are parking there. I hear people say they're parking with Gantz, but he's not necessarily who they prefer. When people say that, say, well, you could still have Likud or Bibi make a comeback. What makes that unlikely is the people who are parking there are parking because they're rejecting the idea of Likud and Netanyahu. That they're parking there for a reason. Maybe they'll go to others like Bennett or Yossi Cohen should they run. But if you had an election based on the party structure today, yes, the National Unity Party would go from, it has 12 mandates today, 12. It would go from 12 probably up to 35 to 40. And Likud would go from 30-14 to probably 17 or 18. That tells you what the effect of October 7th and its aftermath has been.
A little bit of a tender question here, but there's been some reportage about your turning more toward your Jewish faith after the 6-Day War, becoming a little more disposed toward practicing as a Jew. How much of that gets in the way in terms of, I don't know, when Joe Lieberman died, they talked about him as a centrist. They talk about Bernie Sanders as being too anti-Israel. It gets very confused sometimes with people's Jewish identity because that's the family they're born into, and Israel being a Jewish state. But what do you say to people who say, you can't really be a centrist and you can't really be unbiased if you're Jewish?
What I say to them is, you're saying if you're Jewish, you can't believe in peace?
Good response.
I've spent 40 years trying to make peace there. So, if you say you're Jewish and you can't believe in peace, then you don't understand what being Jewish means. Rodef Shalom means to be a seeker of peace. And there's no higher calling in the Jewish faith than to be a Rodef Shalom.
Well, you've certainly lived your life that way, and I give you immense credit for all that you've done. It must sometimes be terribly exasperating, though, and frustrating when we come to these kind of places where we are now. Anything that stirs hope in your heart?
Yes. I see something that I sought for a long time as a negotiator and was never possible. For a long time, I wanted Arab states to assume more responsibility for Palestinians. And I'm seeing now in my conversations, especially with countries like the Emirates, but not only them, a readiness to assume more responsibility in a way that was never something that was possible before. And that the significance of that is they want to use their position to help Palestinians, but they want to use their relationship with the Israelis to influence what Israel will do. And that's new, and it creates a different potential, number one. Number two, the fact that the Saudis, they haven't walked away from the idea that they're still ready to do the normalization deal, but they want the war to end because they can't do it in this climate. And they will ask something that is designed to be credible, to show they got something for Palestinians that others didn't get as part of the normalization deal. So I think there is a potential here, but a lot depends upon being able to end this war in a way where Hamas can't remilitarize and can't control Gaza, and I think there is a way to do both. No one is going to invest in reconstruction, and the reconstruction needs of Gaza are immense. 70% of all the buildings in the northern part of Gaza have either been destroyed or are uninhabitable. The infrastructure, mostly destroyed. So huge needs for reconstruction, and you have a formula of reconstruction for guaranteed demilitarization, and reconstruction with Hamas not in power. And I think I said it before, even though the level of support for Hamas in Gaza has gone up, and that's a function of the anger right now. But I'll just point to the fact that pre-October 7th, there were polls that showed very low support for Hamas in Gaza. And there was also, and you can get this on YouTube, there was a video called Whispers in Gaza. And it was 24 Palestinians from Gaza, from completely different walks of life, describing what life was like under Hamas, how oppressive it was, how hopeless it was, and this was animated. Their voices were disguised because they understood what the consequence of doing this with Hamas would be. That video got 750,000 views in Gaza. That's pretty extraordinary.
Oh,
so that says something about what the real attitudes, at least pre-October 7th, were within Gaza towards Hamas.
Should the Israelis go into Rafah? We've got to bring this to a conclusion here, but I'd like your wisdom on that.
I think there's a chance that I think they will define demilitarization as having removed all of the battalions. By the way, you dismantle the battalion doesn't mean all those fighters have been killed or arrested, but it means they have no organization, no command control, no structure. They operate more anomically and in more isolated ways. They can still be a problem because many of them will still have their arms. But if you bring in security forces from the outside, which I believe, as I said, that there are Arab states that are prepared for the first time to bring in forces on an interim basis to be a bridge, then you can manage what can be the reconstruction in a way that helps restore Gaza. With a reform PA, brings back a different kind of governance and creates a platform where talks about the future become thinkable.
Well, let me initially thank all of you who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all of you who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you aren't yet a member of this podcast, I invite and urge you to join by going to our website at graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. You can find any previous episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny there, including the one with Daniel Sokach and the one with Amichai Megan, with both have to do, of course, with the Middle East. Also invite you to email any reactions, thoughts, or recommendations you may have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. My thanks to the Great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Colin, Kevin, Jeff, and Colleen. And a special thanks to this week's special guest, Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.